Draft week. 3 words that mean everything to football families. 3 words that can change your life in seconds. DEION Sanders knows this better than almost anyone alive. He's lived it, conquered it, and built a legacy on it. But last year, something happened during draft night that shifted everything. Not just for Shedeur Sanders, his son. Not just for the Cleveland Browns, who made the move, but for Coach Prime himself. He stood there, watching the rounds unfold, and said something that caught everyone off guard. "It changed my life last year, too." Those words weren't about football analysis or draft grades. They were about a father watching his son become the biggest story of the entire draft for all the wrong reasons. A Hall of Famer, a man who built his entire existence on confidence and proving doubters wrong, suddenly faced with something he couldn't control. Someone was passing on his son, round after round. And the world was watching every single moment of it. What happened on that draft night wasn't just another storyline in the NFL calendar. It was a moment that exposed something deeper about the league, about pressure, about legacy, and about what it really means when a young quarterback falls further than anyone expected. This is that story. Draft week arrives like clockwork every April. Teams gather. Prospects wait by their phones. Families sit in living rooms, some celebrating, others disappointed. But draft week in 2024 wasn't like the others. For one family, it became something nobody could have predicted. Something that would linger in conversations, tweet threads, and sports bar debates for years to come. Shedeur Sanders was supposed to hear his name called in the first round. Everyone knew it. Analysts knew it, teams knew it. Even Shedeur himself probably knew it, or at least he thought he did. He was talented, accurate, productive, and he carried one of the most recognizable names in football. His father, DEION Sanders, had just taken over as head coach at Colorado and immediately transformed the program. Everything pointed to a clear trajectory. First-round pick, franchise quarterback. Fresh start for a young, hungry team. But something happened on draft night that nobody saw coming. Not completely, not to this degree. Teams started passing, one after another. The first round ended without Shedeur's name being called. That was surprising. Shocking, even. A projected first-rounder sitting in the green room while other quarterbacks heard their names. It stung, but it wasn't impossible. Draft surprises happen. Teams get scared. Personalities matter. Sometimes the league gets it wrong, and that's just how the business works. Except the passing didn't stop. The second round came and went. Still no call for Shedeur. Now it was getting weird. Now it was starting to feel like something larger was happening. The narrative was shifting in real time. What was a surprise in round 1 was becoming inexplicable by round 2. Analysts who had him ranked high started hedging their bets. Media members who praised him began asking questions about concerns that mysteriously appeared out of nowhere. The machine was already working, already changing the story to make sense of what was happening. Then came the third round, and the fourth, and still, Shedeur Sanders waited. By this point, it wasn't just a draft story anymore. It was history. It was the kind of moment that made everyone in the football world stop scrolling, stop talking about other picks, and focus entirely on one question. What is happening here? How is a player who was once considered a lock for the first round, a young man with elite bloodlines and proven ability, still available this late in the draft? Daniel Jeremiah, one of the most respected evaluators in football, had graded Shedeur significantly higher than where he eventually landed. That wasn't an opinion. That was analysis from someone who watches film for a living. When the Cleveland Browns finally selected him in the 5th round, it didn't feel like a normal draft pick. It felt like they had found something that shouldn't have been available at that point. It felt like the entire league had collectively missed on a prospect or scared itself into passing on him. The pick didn't feel lucky. It felt like the Browns had stolen something. But here's what matters more than the logistics of the slide itself. DEION Sanders watched all of this happen. A man who had orchestrated his entire career around being in control, around confidence, around proving every doubter wrong. a man who had competed at the highest levels of professional football, who had built a legacy so dominant that his name alone opened doors. He watched his son become the biggest story of the draft for all the wrong reasons, and he said something that revealed exactly how deep this moment cut. "It changed my life last year too." Those words aren't casual. Those words aren't throwaway commentary about football. When a Hall of Famer, a man who has experienced more pressure and competition than almost anyone alive, says something like that, he's admitting that what he witnessed affected him in a way that football usually doesn't. This wasn't about stats or tape or draft grades. This was about watching your son go through something you couldn't fix, couldn't shield him from, couldn't simply overcome with your own reputation and legacy. Think about the weight of that moment. Coach Prime has built his entire identity on certainty, on knowing he was the best, on walking into any room and commanding it, on facing down Michael Irvin in the most competitive battles professional football has ever seen, on making decisions, executing them, and proving everyone wrong. But on draft night 2024, he was sitting in a chair, watching, waiting, unable to change the outcome, unable to intercept the doubts, unable to make it stop. The slide changed Shedeur's life by throwing him into the most public pressure cooker imaginable. But for DEION, it was different. It was a reminder that there are things beyond your control. There are moments when your name, your legacy, your accomplishments can't protect the people you love from disappointment. There are nights when you have to sit with discomfort and watch the world form opinions about your son in real time. That's not something Coach Prime had to do very often in his career. And when it happened, it shifted something inside him. That's what he meant. That's what made that statement so powerful. The draft changed everything because for once, the legend couldn't control the narrative. To understand the magnitude of what happened, you have to understand exactly how far Shedeur fell. It's not just about the number of rounds. It's about what each round represents. It's about the doors that close when you're still waiting to hear your name called. Every round that passes without your phone ringing is another moment where the market is making a statement about your value. The first round is the prestige round. It's where franchises invest their future. It's where the money is biggest, the expectations are highest, and the platform is most visible. First-round picks get national television coverage. They get drafted on ESPN's main broadcast. Their families get to walk across a stage. Their careers get framed by the media as destiny. When Shedeur didn't go in the first round, it was unexpected. It was a story, but it wasn't impossible. QBs have fallen out of the first round before. It happens. Teams get nervous. They overthink. Sometimes they're right to be cautious. So round one ending, without Shedeur's name being called, was shocking, but not unprecedented. The second round is where the narrative should have corrected itself. Second-round picks are still premium selections. They're still going to be difference makers. They're still going to be franchise players for the right team. When you get to the second round, and a projected first-rounder is still available, you'd think someone would pull the trigger. The value would be undeniable. You're getting a first-round talent at a second-round price. That's how drafts usually work. Someone finds the value. Someone makes the move. But the second round ended, and Shedeur was still waiting. Now the story was getting uncomfortable. Now it was becoming clear that something unusual was happening. The third round is where the story stops being a surprise and starts being a mystery. Third-round picks are solid contributors. They're players who might start, might develop into something special, might be valuable special teams contributors. But they're not the same as first-round investments. The fall from round 1 to round 3 isn't just about draft position. It's about how the entire industry is suddenly valuing you differently. And when you're sitting in front of cameras, in front of your family, knowing that millions of people are watching you drop further and further, the third round becomes something else entirely. It becomes public humiliation in slow motion. Then came the fourth round. By this point, the narrative had completely shifted. The story wasn't Shedeur Sanders falls to the fourth round. The story was how many more rounds until Shedeur Sanders gets picked. The focus had transformed from draft position to something darker. It had become about what was wrong with him, because that's how the draft machine works. When something unexpected happens, when the market does something that doesn't fit the predetermined narrative, people start creating explanations. They start building stories that make sense of the deviation, and those stories aren't usually kind. They're about character concerns. They're about personality issues. They're about doubts that conveniently appeared the moment the falling started. And then the fifth round came. That's when the Cleveland Browns finally stepped in and made the pick. By that point, Shedeur had fallen further than any quarterback projected to go in the first round in recent memory. He had watched as teams passed. He had seen his name not called. He had experienced the public nature of rejection on one of the biggest stages in professional sports. The fall wasn't just unusual. It was historically significant. It was the kind of thing that gets brought up in draft retrospectives for years, because it was so shocking, so unexpected, so completely at odds with what everyone had anticipated. The numbers tell part of the story, but they don't tell the whole story. 60-some players went before Shedeur in a draft where he was supposed to be a lock for the first 50-plus picks. That's not a small variance. That's not a normal market correction. That's something unprecedented. And the fact that it happened so publicly, so visibly, with cameras on his face and his family sitting nearby, made it something that resonated beyond just football circles. What makes this fall so historically significant is the context. This wasn't a prospect who had question marks from the beginning. This wasn't a player whose scouts were divided on. Shedeur Sanders was universally praised as a talented, productive quarterback from a major program. His father had just transformed Colorado. He had legitimate NFL-level skills. He had arm talent, accuracy, intelligence, and bloodline. Everything suggested he would be a first-round pick. That's what made the fall so jarring. The baseline expectations were so high that every round that passed felt like a betrayal of what everyone had believed. By the time the Browns picked him, the story had become impossible to ignore. This wasn't just another draft. This was the story of draft night. And for DEION Sanders, watching from the sidelines, it was something that cut deeper than any football game ever could. Because this wasn't about him. This was about his son. And for the first time in his legendary career, there was nothing he could do to change the outcome. The NFL draft has a dark magic to it. It's not just about evaluating talent anymore. It's about creating narratives that make sense of outcomes. The draft machine doesn't simply grade players and rank them. It also has the power to rewrite history in real time, to change the story after the fact, and to convince everyone that what they're witnessing now was always inevitable. That's what happened to Shedeur Sanders. And if you understand how this works, you understand why the fall was so damaging beyond just draft position. Before draft night, Shedeur Sanders was a first-round quarterback. That was the consensus. That was what scouts had written in their reports. That was what analysts had repeated on television for months leading up to the draft. He was tough. He was accurate. He was productive. He had played in major games, won big moments, and showed the kind of poise under pressure that NFL teams value. He was talked about as having star power. He was the son of a Hall of Famer, which meant he understood the pressure, understood the expectations, and had been around elite-level football his entire life. All of this was universally acknowledged before the draft started, but here's where the machine gets dangerous. The moment the first team passed on Shedeur, a process began. The moment he wasn't selected in the first round, the narrative started to shift. It's subtle at first. It's just questions being asked. Did teams see something we didn't? Are there character concerns? Is there something about his personality that's making scouts nervous? These questions don't come from newly discovered information. They come from the need to explain why the market is doing something unexpected. The market became the source of truth. If teams are passing, then there must be a reason. And if there's a reason, then maybe what everyone believed before wasn't quite right. By the third round, the narrative had completely inverted. Now Shedeur wasn't a first-round talent that fell. Now he was a prospect who was overrated out of the blue. Suddenly, people who had praised him before were hedging their bets, adding caveats, suggesting that maybe he got too much attention. Maybe he was never that kind of player. Maybe the hype around him had exceeded his actual ability. These weren't based on new film study or deeper analysis. They were based on the simple fact that the draft market wasn't treating him like a first-rounder anymore. So the story had to change to match the market. That's how the machine works. It's a vicious cycle. A player falls further than expected. Teams pass on him. The market deviates from the consensus. So the consensus has to adjust. Analysts have to explain why the deviation happened. And the easiest way to explain it is to retroactively downgrade the player. To suggest that the early evaluations were inflated. To imply that the fall was actually justified all along, that maybe scouts just didn't see the concerns early enough. By the time a player has fallen 4 or 5 rounds, the narrative has been completely rewritten. Now it sounds like the fall was inevitable. It sounds like teams got it right by passing. It sounds like the player was always overrated. This happened to Shedeur in real time. Before the draft, he was a talented, productive quarterback with star power. After the draft, he was suddenly overrated. The only thing that changed was the draft order. The only thing that shifted was the market's decision. But the narrative had to follow the market because the machine requires it. The machine can't have players falling unexpectedly and markets getting it wrong. So the machine rewrites the story to make sense of the outcome. What makes this so dangerous for young players is the permanence of the narrative. Once the story is rewritten, it sticks. It becomes part of how people evaluate you moving forward. It becomes the context through which scouts and coaches see your ability. If you're a player who fell further than expected, you're now playing catch-up, not just in terms of draft position, but also in terms of how people perceive your talent. You have to overcome not just the fall, but also the narrative that the fall created. The draft machine had rewritten Shedeur's story from talented QB with big name to overrated prospect who got too much attention. That's a massive shift in perception. And it happened not because of new information about his ability, but because of the market's decisions. Teams passed on him, so the story had to adjust to justify those decisions. The machine can't have it both ways. The machine can't say that Shedeur was truly a first-round talent and also explain why teams passed on him. So it chose one narrative. He wasn't as good as people thought. But here's the crucial part that nobody wants to admit. The narrative flip reveals something uncomfortable about the draft process itself. It reveals that the machine isn't purely about evaluation. It's about justifying outcomes. It's about making sense of decisions that might not make sense otherwise. When teams pass on a player, they have to believe they're making the right decision. So they're invested in the narrative that the fall created. If Shedeur is overrated, then passing on him makes sense. If the hype was inflated, then teams acted correctly. The narrative protects the decision-makers. It makes them look smart instead of scared. That's what makes the machine so powerful and so cruel. It doesn't just evaluate talent. It protects the people making decisions by rewriting the story of anyone who falls outside their predictions. When a young quarterback experiences a fall like that, experiences public rejection on that scale, there's a predictable path they usually take. They come out angry. They come out bitter. They come out ready to prove everyone wrong, to throw their pain into their work, to use the fall as fuel for revenge. That's the narrative we're used to seeing. That's the story that gets written most often when a prospect falls further than expected. The chip-on-shoulder story, the revenge narrative. The young player who was disrespected and now has something to prove. Shedeur Sanders didn't follow that script, and that's why people are still talking about his response months later. Instead of anger, Shedeur showed maturity. Instead of bitterness, he showed focus. Instead of coming out swinging and trying to prove the entire league wrong immediately, he stayed calm. He stayed grounded. He understood that one night, one draft, one moment didn't define his entire career. That perspective, that emotional intelligence, That ability to separate himself from what had just happened to him publicly. That's rare in young players who have just experienced that kind of disappointment. Think about what he went through. His name was called after so many other quarterbacks. His father, one of the most confident men in football, had to watch it happen. The entire country had just witnessed the biggest surprise of draft night, and that surprise was about Shedeur falling further than anyone expected. Every sports bar, every sports media outlet, every social media platform was talking about him, not because he was getting drafted, but because he wasn't getting drafted as early as anticipated. That's a different kind of attention. That's not the attention you dream about when you're preparing for the draft. But what Shedeur did next was crucial. He kept working. He didn't use the fall as an excuse to spiral or to suddenly question his own abilities. He didn't let the public narrative consume him. He stayed focused on what he could control. He didn't go on social media rants. He didn't do interviews questioning why teams passed on him. He didn't make himself the story by reacting emotionally to what had just happened. Instead, he disappeared into the work. He prepared for his new reality with the Cleveland Browns. He showed up ready to compete. That's what sets this story apart from so many others. In a world of young athletes who are connected to everything, who are constantly responding to criticism, who are always trying to control the narrative, Shedeur did something almost old-fashioned. He let his actions speak instead of his words. He showed humility without accepting the narrative that he was overrated. He showed determination without turning it into anger. He showed professionalism in the face of something that would have been understandable to be upset about. And the sports world noticed. Fans noticed. Browns fans especially noticed. Because when you see someone get embarrassed, when you watch them experience public rejection, when you witness something that would break a lot of people, and they respond with grace and focus instead of defensiveness and anger, it creates a connection. It creates respect. It makes people want to root for them, not because they feel sorry for them, but because they're impressed by them. This is important for the Browns organization and for Shedeur's future, because the response revealed something that the draft machine had tried to hide. It revealed that character and intelligence that scouts had supposedly missed. It revealed that Shedeur Sanders had qualities that don't show up in film study or at the combine. It revealed that he had been taught something more valuable than football mechanics. He had been taught how to handle pressure, how to face adversity without crumbling, how to maintain perspective when the world is watching and judging. Coach Prime taught him that. Living around DEION Sanders, growing up in that environment, hearing the stories about battles with Michael Irvin and how to handle the pressure at the highest levels of sport, that all mattered more than any draft grade could measure. The lessons that couldn't be quantified, that couldn't be captured on tape, that could only be learned through experience and example. Those lessons showed up on draft night when everyone was watching. The response also did something else that's often overlooked. It created a narrative that contradicted the one the machine had created. The machine said Shedeur was overrated. The market said teams were right to pass. The fall had supposedly proved something negative about his ability or his character. But then Shedeur's actions contradicted all of that. By responding with maturity, by showing focus, by not letting the fall define him, he was saying something without saying it. I'm not what the draft machine just tried to tell you I am. That's powerful. That's the kind of thing that genuinely impresses people in sports. That's the kind of response that doesn't just earn respect from fans, but also from coaches who suddenly have to evaluate whether they made the right decision in passing. That's the kind of maturity that makes people question whether the narrative they accepted was actually true. By the time training camp rolled around, Shedeur Sanders had already won something that draft position can't measure. He had won the respect of people who were watching him not just for how he played, but for how he responded to adversity. And that's a foundation that draft position can't build. DEION Sanders has lived his entire life in control. From the moment he stepped onto a football field as a child, he understood something fundamental. If you're better than everyone else, if you're faster, if you're smarter, if you're more confident, then you control the outcome. That wasn't arrogance. That was just how he saw the game. He didn't wait for things to happen to him. He made things happen. He didn't hope for opportunities. He created them. He didn't worry about what doubters would say. He proved them wrong before they could even finish talking. This mindset wasn't just about football. It became the foundation of everything DEION Sanders did. It became how he approached his career, his business ventures, his coaching, his life. He built an empire on confidence. He built a legacy on certainty. He walked into rooms knowing he belonged there. He made decisions decisively. He executed them flawlessly. And when people doubted him, when people said he couldn't do something, he showed them they were wrong. That was the DEION Sanders formula, and it worked for decades. But draft night 2024 was different. On that night, Coach Prime couldn't control the outcome. He couldn't make teams draft his son higher. He couldn't force the market to value Shedeur the way he believed he should be valued. He couldn't use his legendary status to change what was happening in real time on national television. For once, his confidence, his legacy, his Hall of Fame resume, none of it could protect his son from disappointment. None of it could intercept the doubts. None of it could stop the slide. That's what made it hurt. That's what made it different from anything else DEION had experienced in his football life. Think about what DEION has dealt with. He's competed against the best receivers in NFL history. He's faced Michael Irvin in battles that are still talked about with reverence and intensity. He's negotiated at the highest levels of professional sports. He's built programs from the ground up. He's made decisions that affected hundreds of people. He's lived under the pressure that comes with being one of the greatest cornerbacks who ever played the game. Through all of it, he maintained control. Through all of it, he could fall back on his abilities, his intelligence, his superiority. But you can't be superior to draft pick decisions. You can't outplay the market. You can't intercept the doubts that teams have about your son. You can't be confident enough or smart enough or legendary enough to change what the NFL decides to do. And that's a powerless feeling for someone who has built his entire identity on having power. What made it worse was the knowledge. DEION knows what it takes to succeed at the highest levels of sports. He knows what pressure does to people. He knows what doubts sound like when they're coming from everywhere. He knows what it feels like to be judged by millions of people. He lived through all of that successfully, but he also knows how difficult it is. He knows how many people crack under that pressure. He knows how many fall away when the expectations get too high. And now, he was watching his son step into that exact same fire, but with the added difficulty of having DEION Sanders as his father. That's a unique burden. It's not just about being a young quarterback trying to make it in the NFL. It's about being the son of a legend, living in the shadow of one of the greatest careers in football history. And now having to prove yourself in front of everyone while dealing with both your own expectations and the weight of the family name. DEION understood that burden better than anyone because he lived it in reverse. He was the legend. He carried the name. He had to constantly prove he deserved everything he achieved. And now his son was going to have to do the same thing. So when Coach Prime said that the draft changed his life too, he wasn't exaggerating. He was admitting something that a man of his stature doesn't usually admit. He was acknowledging that he couldn't control everything. That he couldn't use his legendary status to protect his son from pain. That sometimes, no matter how confident you are, no matter how successful you've been, you have to sit and watch things unfold and accept that you're powerless to change them. That's humbling. That's the kind of humbling that changes you. The draft wasn't just about Shedeur. It was about DEION realizing that his legacy, as great as it is, has limits. It was about watching his son go through something that he couldn't have prepared him for, no matter how much football knowledge he passed down. It was about the reality that your children have to walk their own path, make their own way, and sometimes that path is harder than you'd like it to be. All of DEION's references to Michael Irvin and those legendary battles weren't just nostalgia. They were reminders of something he'd learned through decades of competition. They were reminders that greatness requires more than just talent. It requires the ability to handle pressure. It requires intelligence. It requires adaptability. It requires the fortitude to face down the best and not blink. And DEION was hoping, he was probably praying, that Shedeur had inherited those qualities. Because he knew that Shedeur was going to need them. The draft changed DEION's life because it shifted his perspective. It made him understand, in a way he hadn't before, that being a father is different from being a competitor. That watching someone you love go through pain is harder than going through pain yourself. That your legacy, no matter how great, is just a foundation. What matters is what your children build on top of it. The moment the Cleveland Browns selected Shedeur Sanders in the 5th round, they inherited something bigger than a quarterback. They inherited an opportunity that doesn't come around often in the NFL. They got a player who was projected to go in the 1st round at a significantly reduced draft cost. From a pure value perspective, they won the trade. They got a premium talent at a discount price, but that value only means something if they know what to do with it. And that's where the real test begins. Here's what a lot of teams fail to understand about young quarterbacks. Getting the quarterback is just the beginning. It's not the hard part. The hard part is what comes after. The hard part is building around him. The hard part is giving him what he needs to succeed. The hard part is creating an environment where a young QB can actually develop and reach his potential. That's where most teams mess up. They draft a QB, they feel like they've solved their problems, and then they move on to other things. They don't invest the resources necessary to protect their investment. They don't get serious about surrounding that QB with talent. And then, 2 years later, they're wondering why their draft pick didn't work out. The Browns can't make that mistake. Not with Shedeur. Not after what just happened on draft night. Shedeur has already been through one public trauma. He's already experienced the fall that shocked the league. He's already dealt with the narrative flip. He's already shown the maturity to respond the right way. But what he hasn't done yet is prove it on an NFL field. And here's what matters. A young QB can't prove anything if he doesn't have the right support structure around him. You can't evaluate whether a quarterback is good if he's constantly getting hit. You can't see what he's capable of if his receivers can't get open. You can't judge his potential if he's playing behind a leaky offensive line that collapses every other play. That's why the Browns' approach in this draft is going to tell you everything you need to know about whether they actually believe in Shedeur Sanders. It's not about what they say. It's about what they do with their draft capital. The Browns have multiple picks early in this draft, picks that matter, picks that can change the trajectory of their offense. And the question is simple. Are they going to use those picks to build around Shedeur, or are they going to hedge their bets and take other positions? Are they going to go all in on making this work, or are they going to treat Shedeur like a late-round pick who just got lucky? The critical needs are clear. First, Shedeur needs protection. A clean pocket, an offensive line that gives him time to let plays develop, time to find his receivers, time to make decisions without constantly looking over his shoulder. This isn't optional. This is foundational. You cannot develop a young quarterback if he's under constant pressure. You cannot see what a QB is capable of if he's scrambling for his life every play. An offensive lineman, especially a left tackle, isn't a luxury for a team with a young QB. It's a necessity. It's the foundation everything else is built on. Second, Shedeur needs weapons. He needs receivers who can beat coverage. He needs targets who can create space and make his job easier. He needs playmakers who can stretch the defense and keep safeties honest. This matters because even with good protection, a quarterback needs people who can separate and get open. You need receivers who understand the NFL game, who can run routes with precision, who can make contested catches. Without that, protection only delays the inevitable. The QB still has nowhere to throw the ball. Here's the thing that separates good organizations from bad ones. Some teams think protection and weapons are either-or decisions. Either you draft an offensive lineman or you draft a receiver. You pick one, you prioritize one. But that's not how you build around a young QB. That's how you build failure. You need both. Because weapons without protection means the QB gets hit, and protection without weapons means the QB has nowhere to throw. Both are incomplete. Both fail on their own. The Browns need to understand that if they're really serious about Shedeur Sanders, they need to do something rare in the NFL. They need to invest multiple premium picks in building around their QB. They need to get a receiver in the early rounds, someone like Jordan Tyson or Carnell Tate, someone who can create space, someone who can be a reliable target when the pocket gets tight. And they need to get offensive line help, potentially even a left tackle, someone who can go out there and protect Shedeur every single Sunday. This isn't boring. This isn't unglamorous. This is how you actually develop young quarterbacks. This is how you protect your investment. This is how you show your organization that you have a plan beyond just landing a talent late in the draft. You show it with picks. You show it with resources. You show it with commitment. Because here's what happens if the Browns don't do this. Shedeur comes in as a young QB who already carries baggage from the draft. He's already dealing with doubts from the market. He's already had to overcome a public fall. Now, if he doesn't have protection, if he doesn't have weapons, he's going to struggle. And when he struggles, people are going to say the market was right. They're going to say teams were justified in passing. They're going to use his struggles as proof that Shedeur was overrated all along. The narrative will calcify. It will be too late to change it. But if the Browns get this right, if they use this draft to build a real offense around Shedeur, if they show commitment with their picks and resources, then something different happens. Then Shedeur gets the chance to actually prove himself. Then the story of draft night changes from a tragedy to a triumph. Then the Browns don't just get a talented QB at a discount. They get a foundation for the next decade. That's the test. That's what everyone should be watching. When people talk about Shedeur Sanders, they talk about the name. They talk about his father being a legend. They talk about him being Coach Prime's son. And in doing so, they often miss something crucial. They miss the fact that Shedeur didn't just inherit a famous last name. He inherited a football education that most players will never have access to, no matter how talented they are or where they train. Shedeur grew up in a football laboratory, not a metaphorical one. A literal environment where elite-level football knowledge was being transmitted on a daily basis. His father isn't just any retired player. DEION Sanders was one of the greatest defensive minds and competitors the game has ever seen. That knowledge, that understanding of the game, that intelligence about how to think at the highest levels of football, that was Shedeur's environment. That was what he heard about every single day of his life. Think about what Shedeur has been exposed to. He's heard his father talk about leverage, about how to use your body position to create advantages, about the small details that separate elite players from good players. He's heard about disguise, how to fake one thing and do another, how to manipulate defenders into thinking something is happening when something different is actually happening. He's heard about timing, about how milliseconds matter, about how receivers and QBs need to be synchronized perfectly for plays to work. He's heard about footwork, about how the way you plant your feet determines the velocity and accuracy of your throw, about how slight adjustments in your mechanics create completely different outcomes. These aren't things Shedeur learned from a quarterback coach at a camp. These aren't concepts he read about in a book. These are things he's heard discussed at dinner. Things he's watched being illustrated in film study sessions. Things he's absorbed through osmosis just by being around his father and the conversations his father has. That's the advantage that most young quarterbacks don't have. That's the education that can't be bought or taught in a traditional way. DEION's references to Michael Irvin weren't just nostalgia. They were a reminder of what Shedeur has learned about competition at the absolute highest level. Those battles between DEION and Irvin weren't just about physical talent. They were about intelligence. They were about two elite minds trying to outthink each other. They were about leverage and technique, and reading the other person's intentions and adapting in real time. That's the kind of football that DEION was talking about when he said that Irvin wasn't just strong and tough, but that he was smart, that he knew how to trick defenders, that he knew how to use leverage to his advantage, that he knew how to make top athletes think twice. And Shedeur has been in rooms where that level of analysis is happening. He's heard it. He's absorbed it. He's learned it not from books or coaches, but from one of the greatest football minds who ever played the game. That's a massive advantage, and it's one that the draft machine can't quantify. It's one that doesn't show up on tape. It's one that can't be measured at the combine, but it exists. It's real. And it matters. This is why it sounds wrong when people say Shedeur doesn't know the game or can't learn it. He's been learning the game his entire life from arguably the greatest teacher he could possibly have. Now, does that mean he's guaranteed to be successful in the NFL? No. Knowledge isn't the same as execution. Knowing how to do something isn't the same as being able to do it under pressure against the best defense in the world. But it does mean that the foundation is there. It does mean that Shedeur sees the game differently than most young quarterbacks. It does mean he has access to a level of understanding that most people have to work years to develop. The Browns need to understand this about their new QB. Shedeur hasn't just grown up around football. He's grown up around elite-level football thinking. He's heard conversations about minutiae that most players never think about. He's been exposed to perspectives from one of the greatest players and minds the game has ever seen. That's not something you can build or develop. That's something he already has. What that means practically is that Shedeur should develop faster than your typical young QB. It means he should understand concepts more quickly. It means he should be able to process information more rapidly because he's already familiar with the way it's being discussed. It means he comes in with a baseline understanding of NFL-level football intelligence that takes most young QBs years to develop. But here's the flip side. It also means there's pressure. It means people will expect him to understand things immediately that other young QBs need time to learn. It means his father's knowledge becomes a measuring stick. It means there's an expectation that Shedeur should be more ready than a typical young QB because of his education. And that pressure can be good. It can drive him to work harder and study more deeply. But it can also be unfair if people don't understand that having knowledge and being able to execute that knowledge under NFL pressure are two completely different things. The Browns organization needs to manage that carefully. They need to expect more from Shedeur because he's had advantages most young QBs don't have. But they also need to give him the grace to develop, to make mistakes, to learn through experience. They need to build the support structure around him that allows him to take what he's learned intellectually and translate it into on-field performance. Because if they get that balance right, if they combine Shedeur's football IQ with the right coaching, the right protection, the right weapons, then what happened on draft night could be remembered as the day the Browns won, not the day Shedeur lost. It could be remembered as the day the entire league exposed itself by letting a first-round level QB fall into one team's hands. That's what's possible if the Browns understand what they really have. Here's the question that everyone should be asking, but most people are too afraid to voice. Did the NFL expose Shedeur Sanders on draft night, or did the NFL expose itself? Because there's a massive difference between those two things. One narrative says that the market was right, that teams saw something negative about Shedeur that scouts had missed, that the fall was justified because there were real concerns about his ability, his personality, his character, or his potential. That Shedeur needed to be humbled, needed to be taken down a peg, needed to learn what it feels like to not be the most celebrated name in the room. That narrative protects the market. It makes the teams that passed look smart. But what if that narrative is wrong? What if the market didn't expose Shedeur? What if the market exposed itself? What if teams passed on Shedeur not because of legitimate concerns, but because they got scared of the narrative around him? What if they overthought it? What if they let the name, the attention, the personality concerns override what they saw on tape? What if they made a collective decision that turned out to be a massive mistake? What if the entire league conspired, accidentally or not, to miss on a legitimate first-round talent? That's possible. That's actually happened before in NFL history. There have been drafts where teams collectively miss on talent. There have been players who fell further than they should have because the market got it wrong. There have been moments where one team's willingness to go against the consensus turned out to be the most valuable pick of the entire draft. And sometimes, looking back years later, people realize that teams weren't being smart. They were being scared. Here's what we know for certain. Shedeur Sanders was, by almost every evaluation metric, a first-round talent before the draft. That's not opinion. That's evaluation. That's what scouts and analysts said. That's what film study showed. And then, for reasons that we still don't fully understand, teams passed. Maybe it was the name. Maybe it was personality concerns that mysteriously appeared the moment the sliding started. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was just a perfect storm of uncertainty that caused the entire market to move in one direction. But whatever the reason, what actually happened is that a young man with real NFL talent got rejected on national television. And then he responded with maturity, focus, and professionalism. And then his father, one of the greatest competitors who ever played the game, admitted that it affected him in a way that very few things have. And then one team, the Cleveland Browns, got an opportunity to either prove that the market was right to pass or prove that the market got it badly wrong. This is where the story becomes about responsibility. The Browns didn't just get a talented QB late in the draft. They got a player who carries with him the weight of the biggest fall in recent draft history. They got a young man who has already proven something through his response to adversity. They got a quarterback whose narrative is still being written. And what they do in this next chapter, what they do in this draft, how they build around him, whether they give him what he needs to succeed, will determine whether the market was exposed as wrong or whether Shedeur's fall was ultimately justified. That's a massive responsibility. That's more than just drafting well. That's about understanding what you have and being willing to commit to it. Young quarterbacks fail in the NFL for a lot of reasons. Sometimes it's because they're not talented enough. Sometimes it's because they didn't get the right coaching. Sometimes it's because the organization didn't commit enough resources to building around them. Sometimes it's because the support structure failed before the QB even got a real chance to prove himself. A lot of young QBs fail not because they can't play, but because they never got the platform to actually show what they could do. The Browns need to make sure that doesn't happen with Shedeur. They need to understand that if he fails, the league will look back at draft night and say, "See, teams were right to pass. The market got it right." But if he succeeds, if he becomes a legitimate franchise quarterback, then the conversation changes. Then people talk about the night the Browns won. Then the story of the slide becomes about how one organization saw through the market's collective doubt and found gold. The pressure is on Cleveland. Not just to develop a young QB, which is hard enough, but to prove that they understand value, that they understand how to build around a QB, that they understand the difference between getting a talented player and actually supporting that player to success. And here's what makes this story bigger than just football. It's about whether the modern NFL market, with all its analysis and film study and scouting reports and expert opinions, can actually miss. It's about whether the collective intelligence of an entire league can be wrong. It's about whether a young man who got rejected can come back and prove that he belonged in the first round all along. The draft changed DEION Sanders' life because it forced him to confront something he usually doesn't have to confront: powerlessness. The draft gave the Cleveland Browns something valuable, an opportunity. And the draft gave Shedeur Sanders something that might matter more than draft position. It gave him a chip on his shoulder. It gave him fuel. It gave him a reason to prove everyone wrong. So the real question isn't whether the NFL exposed Shedeur Sanders. The real question is whether the NFL exposed itself. And we're going to find out the answer over the next few years, as Shedeur's career unfolds, as the Browns either build a championship team or squander their opportunity. That's when we'll know. That's when the market's decision will either be vindicated, or it will be recognized as one of the biggest misses in recent draft history. And right now, with everything that's happened since draft night, with Shedeur's response and Coach Prime's honesty, and the Browns' opportunity to do something special, there's real reason to believe that this could be a story about how an entire league got it wrong. Draft week changed everything. For Shedeur Sanders, it was a public humiliation that tested his character and forced him to grow up faster than he should have had to. For DEION Sanders, it was a reminder that there are things in life you can't control, no matter how much power or success you've achieved. For the Cleveland Browns, it's an opportunity that only works if they have the courage to commit to it fully. The story of Shedeur's draft slide isn't a finished narrative. It's the beginning of something that's still being written. Every pick the Browns make in this draft will add to the story. Every resource they commit to building around their young QB will either confirm that the market was right to pass or that the market was wrong. Every moment of Shedeur's NFL career will either validate the collective doubt or prove that an entire league missed on a talent. What makes this story significant isn't just what happened on draft night. It's what happens next. It's how organizations respond to opportunities that the market creates. It's how young players respond to adversity. It's how legends like DEION Sanders learn to let go of control and trust in their children. The draft exposed something about the NFL, about success, about what happens when pressure meets opportunity. The question now is what all the teams, especially Cleveland, are going to do with what they learned. That's the real story. That's what matters now.